Hello, everyone. This is Horace Cordier, and we are here with Rock and a Hard Place. And we've been away for quite a while, but we're going to try and give you more regular content on a timely basis. So let's just get going on this one right away. So, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to talk about the Bayley era of Iron Maiden, which is probably one of the most controversial, and it's an interesting period for the band. So, I'm here with John, and John and I are both, I would say we're fans of this era. We're definitely fans of Blaze. We have some interesting things to say as we analyze these albums, who I think in some ways get a raw deal. So we're here to talk about the X Factor and Virtual 11. So let's start with the X Factor. This is the new remaster, not that new. It's actually came out maybe 6 months ago. Who knows? Anyway, let's get started. And John is going to start by talking about what he likes and doesn't like about the X Factor. John?
Well, yeah. So thanks. I really, really like this album. I think this is one of Iron Maiden's most underrated albums. Of course, got a lot of flack when it came out, but it's, Blaze has said in an interview recently that this sort of kick-started the progressive era of Iron Maiden, right? For better or worse, according to who you talk to, right? So a lot of people don't like the fact that Maiden is writing all these longer compositions, but that really started on this album. And it's sort of exemplified by that opening track, which is my favorite song on the album, Sign of the Cross. And it just, when I think about the sort of the balls, for lack of a better term, right? You've just lost your iconic singer who's been in the band since 82, 83, right? Bruce Dickinson. And you're introducing a new singer, new era, and you start with an epic song that begins with Gregorian monks chanting and just like this long sort of epic. I mean, it's a real statement of purpose. And I think it quite exemplifies the dark tone of the album, the progressive tone of the album. And I think that it's just a great track. It's a track that Maiden also sort of pull out every so often for live shows still. And it's fantastic.
Yeah, I agree.
Another thing you'll constantly hear people say is like, well, Blaze is a good singer, but he's not a good singer for Maiden. I disagree. I think that the darker material on this album sort of fits his vocal style, his lower range, and more sort of baritone sort of style. So I don't think that's an issue. A lot of, I mean, and this also, when we're talking about like thematically, it's not that big of a shift also from the previous album. We were already starting to get darker lyrical themes with Fear of the Dark especially, where, for example, you have a number of songs on this album which deal with sort of war themes, right? Like Fortunes of War, Edge of Darkness is based on Apocalypse Now. You had some of that on Fear of the Dark with Afraid to Shoot Strangers, for instance.
Right.
So that sort of carries over. But I really like the sound of the album. I like the darker themes. I think there's a number of standout tracks. I mean, the first single, "Man on the Edge," is great. Even fans that sort of don't give this era a lot of credit tend to really sort of support that song, right? "Lord of the Flies," I think, is a really great underrated track. And then as the album progresses, I mean, there's maybe one or two tracks in the second half that are quite, where it starts to flag a bit, like "Blood on the World's Hands" or "Judgment of Heaven" is probably my least favorite song on the album. But 2 a.m. And "The Unbeliever" are just like, again, so much different than what Maiden had done up until this point as well. I mean, so there's like a foot firmly planted in the past, but there's also like an eye towards the future. And I really think, the band got sort of burned by basically abandoning the sort of colorful historical approach that the sort of the classic era sort of albums really showed. But as a sort of as a unified artistic statement, and in my opinion, one of the strongest things about this album is that it holds together very well as a unified statement, and it really feels like of a piece. Yeah, I mean, I think it's better than the last two albums with Bruce before he left the band for the first time, and I would rank it over one or maybe even two of the reunion albums. It's definitely better than the Final Frontier. And depending on what day of the week, I might even rank it over another one of those reunion albums. I just think it's a really strong record. I think that it deserves reevaluation, and I love it. So yeah, those are my thoughts. What do you think?
Well, I'm in agreement with pretty much almost everything that you're saying. I think what's interesting about this album is if you put it in the context of what was going on with Iron Maiden previous to this, they'd had a very difficult tour. They had a very difficult tour with Bruce Dickinson, who was clearly unhappy with the band. Fear of the Dark is sort of a fascinating album because it's a really kind of a schizophrenic mess. There's some extremely strong material on it. There's also some of the worst things that Maiden had ever done with Bruce, and it's pretty obvious that that's probably the weakest album that they did with Bruce overall. No Prayer for the Dying was more like an attempt to try to sound like the old style, and it's a little forced. But there's great stuff on Fear of the Dark with the title track, but there's bad stuff. So once Bruce leaves, he's in his own experimental period. He's dealing with Skunk Works and Balls to Picasso, which are also experimental albums. And he's obviously, his musical head was in a very different place. So Steve Harris now is really the complete captain of the ship. And he made a controversial choice with Blaze because Blaze was from Wolfsbane. He had a good voice, but it was not the typical, they were thinking it was going to be Ralph Schliepers from Gamma Ray, somebody that had like that kind of, a lot of the same guys, oddly enough, that were up for the Judas Priest gig. In the wake of they went with Ripper Owens, which is an interesting comparison to this. Steve went for something radically different. They went for a guy who came from a Judas Priest tribute band. So Blaze is now in the band. And what we got is this really fascinating transitionary Maiden album, which doesn't sound really like almost any other Maiden album. It's very dark. It's part of that almost quasi-industrial moment that was sort of taking root in the 90s. You had Black Sabbath with Dehumanizer, which was a very cold and intense and heavy record. And it really fits like metal for the grunge era, as weird as that sounds. And it works. And it's got, it's gothic. It's got that amazing opening track, Sign of the Cross. It's very dark, but it split the fan base kind of down the middle. And there's some fairly well-known rock writers that just blitzed it. It was given absolutely horrible reviews by some people, but over the years, it has steadily developed a bit of a cult following. And truth be told, I've always liked it. It's one of my favorite Maiden albums because it is fresh and interesting. It's different. It's going for something kind of unique. And that's very dark and very industrial. Now, we're talking about the songs. I do think it's part of that era where albums were, because of the CD technology, were starting to get just a little bit too long. So everything is a little padded out. I don't think there was a lot of filter on Steve Harris for this one. But it's interesting. I was reading on Metal Archives about some of the personal history of what was going on with some of the members. And Steve at this time was going through a fairly difficult and painful divorce, which I find fascinating. So there's a lot of very introspective, the lyrics are kind of confessional and a little on the down and depressing side, but it's really a pretty well-written album. And also, I like the production sound. Steve took control of the production on this. It's dark, it's heavy. I like it. And John and I were talking earlier about things like Brave New World, that maybe they sound a little too slick. This doesn't sound too slick. So I think this one for me is, of the Blaze era, this is really the artistic triumph. And I do think it's one of their strongest albums overall. And I would rank it over, honestly, I would rank it probably over No Prayer for the Dying and maybe even Fear of the Dark, though Fear of the Dark is a real problem because the best stuff on Fear of the Dark is fantastic. The worst stuff is terrible. So those are pretty much my thoughts on it. So like you, thumbs up on the first Blaze Bayley Iron Maiden.
X Factor, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, then Virtual 11. Speaking of spotty, so the problems returns. The problem that sort of plagued Fear of the Dark. We have really great tracks side by side with trash like Weekend Warrior and The Apparition, which are two of the worst Maiden songs of all time. I feel similarly about Virtual 11 in the sense that it's a better album. I remember being very disappointed with this, and I used to say flat out that it was my least favorite Maiden record. In revisiting it, I find a lot of the album plays better than I remembered it at the time when it first came out. For instance, I mean, Future Real, sort of like a Man on the Edge kind of sequel, fast, energetic, really catchy, fantastic. And the last song is the one that really is kind of like the sleeper track, Como Estas Amigos. I really like that song. It's so different. It's, again, it takes the strengths of the previous album, the sort of uniqueness, the willingness to be so different than the formula that had been established up to that point, and it sort of really puts that into action. So I like that song a lot too. The problem that I have with this album is that my two least favorite songs on the album are their two longest songs on the album. So The Angel and the Gambler is the worst song on the album. I don't like it. It's long for the sake of being long. It's like a 4-minute song stretched out to 9+ minutes.
It's one of the longest songs in the Maiden catalog. It's over 9 minutes.
And it just is, there's nothing in there to justify that kind of a length. And the second one is, it's going to be a controversial choice because this has become a sort of like a fan favorite. I don't know why, but The Klansman, I think, is it's almost like a parody. This is, to me, again, Maiden sort of retreating back into a formula, and they're writing a song that sort of would fit in the Bruce Dickinson era. Yeah, and the ugly cover art. The cover art on X Factor is ugly too, but it sort of fits the grimy tone of that album.
Cover art on X Factor is perfect. It's a grimy, dark album. It's grimy, dark photos of Eddie having a vivisection. So yes, it's fine.
Whereas this one is just like, I don't know, it's sort of like
it's like Avatar Maiden. I don't know, it's garbage.
Yeah. So Klansman, I think, is trying for the Bruce era sort of aesthetic or the song, lyrical theme, right? The sort of the whole middle section. But Blaze's voice doesn't fit that kind of a style. And so that is a mismatch of Blaze's voice. And I get a sense listening to it that Harris and company are thinking, okay, we need to go back. Harris is the sole writing credit on that track. Yes. I just think he's saying, okay, we got to go back to what works. We got to do a song like The Trooper, or something like with like a battle theme, and it doesn't work.
Well, I'm thinking more like he's trying to do something almost like To Tame a Land, or Trooper's like an in-your-face rocker. But I'll get to that on my thoughts. I'm cutting into you. Go on.
So those two songs are, I did the math. Those two songs are a third of the running time, and they're my two least favorite songs on the album. So that really pulls the album down. And even on the other songs, which have some interesting melodies, like The Educated Fool, or When Two Worlds Collide. Sometimes I think they could be edited a bit. It's this. You're starting to get the repeating chorus effect, which, as much as Brave New World is seen as sort of like a comeback, and it is a very strong record, there are some songs on that album where the chorus is just almost like dutifully repeated over and over again, like the title track, Brave New World. How many times does Bruce Dickinson sing Brave New World in that song, right? You get some of that here as well. So whereas X Factor is progressive, I find that Virtual 11, it's sort of like more of a lateral move, and actually more of a backwards lateral move, if that makes sense. So I like some of the material. I like Como Estas Amigos. I like Future Real. I hate two of the tracks, Angel and the Gambler and The Klansman, and the rest I'm sort of mixed on. Interesting melodies, could be better constructed, but a better record than I remembered it. Not the out and out bad release that I thought it was at the time, or the letdown after I found X Factor so intriguing. So yeah, I mean, some interesting stuff to really to find on this record. Worth revisiting.
Yeah. So I'm in agreement with a fair amount of that. Though I have to say, I just have to quickly check this. But if I remember correctly, that was the tour. That's the tour that I saw. I saw them on that tour. And so I'll quickly start with my Virtual 11 concert story, which is actually a fairly painful but highly amusing one. So I saw them on that tour, and keeping in mind that Maiden had at one point been headlining Madison Square Garden. So here they are. I'm in New York City, and they're at the Roseland Ballroom, which is a decent sized venue. It's not a tiny club. It's a big club, but I don't think it's as big as the Palladium, which Motorhead were playing on, like the Iron Fist tour, which I saw. So they was a step down from that, or even if it was the same size. And it was a bloodbath. So they were up there playing. Blaze, lovely guy, trying really hard, and just outright mockery from the audience. I mean, I had a guy standing next to me who was literally through the whole show just mocking, and saying things like, "Oh man, I could be home in my living room watching a Kojak be more entertaining than this shit. Like, what the fuck?" And I mean, to my discredit, I found this guy more amusing, entertaining than a lot of what was going on stage, because Blaze was trying so hard, but it was embarrassing. And he kept saying things like, "I just want to thank metal fans for sticking by metal." And he'd be in the middle of these like pro heavy metal speeches, sticking with Iron Maiden and, blah, blah. And guys in the front row would be, "You suck." I mean, it was painful. And I mean, I remember I walked out with a little Virtual 11 keychain, which I wish I had not lost. It was like the cheesiest, saddest little like Virtual 11, like from that terrible album cover. It was just sad times on Planet Iron Maiden. So they're now one of the most popular bands in the world. So everything worked out in the end, and Blaze has a great solo career, great guy. So now on to the album. I don't have the same formula that John does. So yes, there are 2 songs on this that I consider weak, and I'm going to be the second voice to actually say that I don't like The Klansman either. I think it's ridiculous. And the fact is, even when they play it live with Bruce, the cheese factor is off the charts. I mean, on the new Live in Mexico album, he's like, "This is based on Braveheart." And by the way, I think Braveheart's kind of cheesy. "This is based on Braveheart. It's true." It's just like a parody of an Iron Maiden song about a famous historical epic, which is, like Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner. So not a fan of The Klansman. The Angel and the Gambler is one of the worst songs in the Maiden catalog. Completely agree on that. And what's going on there is Steve Harris is a huge classic rock and a huge Who fan, and he's trying to rewrite the Iron Maiden version of Won't Get Fooled Again, and it's a total failure. It goes on for like 9.5 minutes. It's got that same sort of rolling riff that you remember from like certain keyboard-dominated Who tracks, which were awesome, but Blaze ain't Roger Daltrey, and the riff is not Won't Get Fooled Again. So you have 2 big duds there. The other problem is it's an album that's trying to be, it's what the English call a dog's breakfast. So it's trying to be a little bit of everything, and it's a little bit of a mess. So they've abandoned the outright dirge and doom of the X Factor, and they're trying to bring back a little bit of the thing that made them, the Trooper, 2 Minutes to Midnight, that kind of thing. And it doesn't totally work. And also there are things on the record that just seem like lesser clones of early. So you have Man on the Edge from X Factor, which is a killer track. And Future Real is a very good track, but it's Man on the Edge Part 2. It's like they're trying to, and Angel and the Gambler is trying to be the Klansman. And we may knock the Klansman, but the Klansman is an infinitely superior song to the Angel and the Gambler. So you've got all that going on. And then repetitive choruses. John and I joked about this for years. So when I was listening to these prepping for the show, I counted the number of times they say "when lightning," it's 8 times. So lightning strikes twice, 8 times in the chorus. When lightning strikes twice, 8 times. That's too much. So, and I like that song. And then there's some slightly awkward transitions and things in the album. Now, the good stuff though, I generally like the album. I'm very fond of The Educated Fool. I find it very entertaining. I enjoy Don't Look Into the Eyes of a Stranger. I completely agree with John that the closing track is maybe my favorite on the album. It's an emotional, interesting, it's got a cool lyric. Como Estás Amigos is a really good song. Future Real is fun. Angel and the Gambler, Lightning Strikes Twice, clumsy chorus, not great. The Klansman, not a fan. When Two Worlds Collide, okay. I mean, some of the lyrics are funny. I just realized I mixed up the Klansman with Sign of the Cross because I keep thinking the Klansman was on the first album. It's not. Anyway, so it shows that this is an era that it's a problematic era, but I would say of the 2 albums in this Blaze period, the first one is significantly better than the second one. And that's kind of my closing thoughts on Virtual those are my thoughts on the two. Do you have any final words on the Blaze era? By the way, Blaze plays these songs live on a lot of his live albums, which is kind of interesting if you want to check out some of those live versions. And I will take this quick moment to recommend that people check out Blaze's solo career. He's actually done some very good stuff.
That's what I was going to say. I was going to say some of those solo albums are fantastic. 10th Dimension is incredible. Much better album than Virtual 11. Really plays to his strength, right? So yeah, I mean, I think X Factor is a underrated classic. I think Virtual 11 has some good songs, and also Wolfsbane, Live Fast Die Fast is a cracker of a record. So I recommend that one too. But yeah, I just I thought it was an interesting topic just to go to this period, because so often you'll see on like Maiden ranking shows, people will just sort of dispense with these albums right away and be like, I'm going to focus on the Bruce era, or like these are the last two, and then I just think they're worth digging into because there's some interesting stuff on them. So.
I think there are a lot of bands that have, and we'll be doing future shows along these lines, but there are interesting sort of side roads traveled during bands' careers. And the Maiden Virtual 11, the Virtual 11 X Factor period, to me, is very similar to things like Black Sabbath during the Born Again era, things like Motorhead during the Another Perfect Day era, Yes during the Drama era, if we get a little bit out of the metal thing, where, there are interesting periods in a band's history where they have different lineups and they do these very interesting records that are not bad records. They're just outliers in the catalog. And there's an unfortunate tendency amongst the hardcore fans to just sort of completely dismiss them as being unworthy. And it's a much longer era, but I would say the same thing for the Tony Martin era and Black Sabbath. There are just parts, but these were, really interesting because this is the last thing I'll say is I am old enough to remember distinctly the creation of these albums and the period. And I remember I was a faithful reader of Kerrang! And I remember we all read through the essentially fairly long audition process as, Maiden decided to pick their new singer, and there were rumors, and maybe it was this guy, maybe it was the guy from Gamma Ray. There were all sorts of crazy stories. And I remember that huge like front page Kerrang! Story where it's like Blaze in front of a car and he's popping champagne, and it's Steve Harris, this is our new lead singer. And a lot of people were like, Blaze from Wolfsbane, that's crazy. And then other people were like, oh, that's awesome, we love Wolfsbane. So it was kind of interesting to live through all that. But I think as we look back on the Maiden catalog, I think there's some good stuff in both of these albums. And the very last thing I will say is I would absolutely recommend that if you haven't heard these and you're an Iron Maiden fan, you've only heard the Bruce stuff, definitely check them out. But when you do check them out, start with the X Factor. And that's it for this episode of Rockin' a Hard Place. And I'm happy to have my friend John with me. And we are going to be back sooner rather than later. Stay heavy, everybody.